Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thank you for watching Inquiry. The news, sadly, is not good. Last week, the RBI reported a severe shock to the economy. The central government has been defaulting on GST payments to the states. Even health workers' salaries are held up. The CMIE reported 50 lakh jobs lost in July. And while the markets are buoyant, the small and medium enterprises that make up the spine of this country are struggling to breathe. And now comes the latest blow. India's GDP is down by a staggering 24%. The finance minister has called this situation an act of God. And the government has often claimed that India is well on its way to being a 5 trillion economy. But many of these trends were in place even before COVID began. So let's set the hype aside and ask, what is the solution to this economic mess? And how big is the mess really? Seeking answers, I'm delighted to have Dr. Raghuram Rajan on Inquiry today, one of the world's most renowned economists. He teaches at Chicago University, was the former RBI Governor, the former chief economist at the IMF, and most famously, before 2008, he predicted a catastrophic financial meltdown. He's also spoken of how crony capitalism is hollowing out India's democracy. So what's his take on the economy now? And what would he do to fix it? Thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Rajan.
Sure, happy to be here.
Dr. Rajan, I've already spelt out the bad news. India's GDP has contracted in an unprecedented way. The RBI's report came out last week and it advocated a lot of government spending. It said the poor had been the most severely hit. It spoke about how the massive corporate tax cut that was given last year did not result in any new investment cycles, but went into building the bank balances of big corporates. I've already spoken of the job loss, about the stalled GST payments. So overall, the situation is really gloomy. You've spoken also about how the fiscal deficit is likely to hit about 15%. And yet, despite all of this, and many economists who've been flagging this, the government has largely been in denial. So, rather than just criticize the government, one is really keen to look for solutions. So if you were in the seat of power right now, how would you design a relief, rehabilitation and stimulus package which would make sense under the circumstances?
I think the elements of any such package are fairly well known. So it's what is surprising is we haven't seen that yet. And I do think the government is being cautious about overspending. That's appropriate given our fiscal situation. But you also have to look at the damage that is being done by not spending. And you have to weigh the two. What are the costs right now of not spending? We have a number of firms, especially in the small and medium sector, which are deeply stressed. And the longer the weak demand conditions last, the more they will be in trouble. So obviously airlines, hotel chains, small hotels, restaurants, all of them. And obviously not all can be helped. So you have to choose in a way that is objective, that helps the entities that are most beneficial to the economy, entities that employ a number of people, that pay significant taxes, that generate profits, and it would be harmful for the economy if they went down. So that's one set. The other set is poor people who've undergone 3-4 months of fairly severe, loss of livelihood. And we need to make sure that they're all in reasonable shape. And, through a broad set of measures we need to check, including through various kinds of surveys, some of which the government is doing, but also, through the government machinery to check what's going on.
Yeah. Sorry to butt in just a little bit, because, like you said, the broad strokes of this is known. But like I was saying, if you were to design that package, could we start with a number? For instance, Dr. Manmohan Singh has said that it would be right to spend up to 10 lakh crore on relief right now. Would you agree with that figure? Do we have enough fiscal space to do that?
It was little and we knew the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Well, Dr. Manmohan Singh is obviously a very insightful economist, so I'm sure he's done a lot of work on those numbers. The problem is we're confronted by an enormous amount of uncertainty. We don't know what the damage is. We don't know what the first quarter, what the GDP numbers will come out at for the period March to June, and for the second quarter from July to September. These are all places where we've had very severe shutdowns. We've had sporadic shutdowns after that. We've had people in a variety of places not going into restaurants, not going to shops.
Sure. Like I said, there's been so much conversation around the economy, and you've had such a nodal position as head of RBI, and you really know the contours of the Indian economy, that if there were some concrete things that one would suggest, say for instance on the MSMEs also, do you think, for instance, right now the government's just going through the loan route, but many may not even have the confidence to take those loans. So when you say support them, don't let them die, could you kind of say some of the concrete steps if you were designing it right now?
There are an enormous number of concrete steps that you should be taking. A lot of them depend on, it's not, I do this and I wait forever and see. I do this and then see what the takedown has been and I do something more. There should be a constant dialogue. So take the MSMEs, right? As you said, some of them may be very wary of taking on more debt, given the debt that they already have, and they may find it hard to get more borrowing from the government. The problem, if the government starts putting in equity or starts giving grants, is who do they give grants to? And in India, the age-old problem is the friends and relatives of the people in influence will scoop up a lot, and it can create massive scandals. So you need something objective, a basis on which the government will put in money. So one possibility is to think about the taxes these entities paid last year. Did they pay GST? Did they pay income taxes? And arrive at a formula. We will put in this amount of money in return for which we will get equity rights, or we will get preferred equity, which has to be paid off first. The company will pay no dividends. So we're talking about medium-sized firms which have a stock market valuation. Those entities, there are ways of trying to make objective the way you will help them. The value of that is later on somebody can't hold you up and say, look, this was corruption. And on the other hand, the entity also has a clear metric that they can take to their banker and say, look, the government is going to put in X amount because by the parameters that it has outlined, that's what I can get. So these are things that can be structured. Look at how the US has structured the Main Street lending program, for example. There are details, who this goes to, how this is going to be spent. And what we're doing is one step further, because many of our entities are over-levered, we put in equity.
So Dr. Rajan, I mean, forgive me for pressing you, but because like I said, there's so much broad talk, but because the government isn't doing very much, there's a kind of stasis right now. One is trying to look for real roots. So you mentioned about, even medium-sized firms, but which are on the stock market. But a large part of India's MSMEs actually is in the informal sector. And, that's really the bulk of India. 90% of India is not even in the formal sector. And that's really where the big conundrum lies. And that's also the biggest employer of people. So what would you do there?
The point with the really tiny MSMEs is that each one doesn't employ very many people. If in fact, the key there is to really talk about how they write down their debts to a level that is sustainable than about equity infusion. So again, you're right to worry about the details, but the details differ depending on which entity you're talking about. For the really tiny entities, they couldn't have gotten loans in the first place. Their real issue is, how do I start up again? How do I get working capital? The important aspect is to give them those working capital loans so that they can start up again. That's about lending, new lending. Remember, those guys are not in any scheme right now because the schemes are all about lending to guys who've already borrowed. These guys haven't been favored by any scheme as of now. That's one. What about the guys who are highly levered, don't have any access to stock markets, etc. Now, you can still put in money into those entities as a government, but you'll have to find different ways to price that money in.
Right.
So that's one set of entities. There are another set of entities who have loans, no stock market, no stock, whatever. They're, three-man, four-man firms, etc. There, the question is, can you write down some of the debt that they have? And so what you need is a process of debt renegotiation, which is rapid and can be done very quickly with their bankers sort of sitting across the table. You need parameters for the banks. Now, in order for the banks to take the hit, the banks have to have capital. And that means you have to think about recapitalizing the banks. That will need fiscal resources. So you have to think through this whole gamut. Right now, we are sort of thinking a little piecemeal. You need to bring it all together.
Right. So I'm going to come to the kind of punch question, which is whether you think the government is doing enough. But before that, I just want to examine some of the things that you've already been saying. One thing you've been repeatedly saying is that this is the time to really push through some of the big, bold reforms, that one has never had political will for. But so far, whatever I've scarred of your interviews, you haven't kind of spelled out what those reforms were. One of the big ones we saw was the labor reform, which actually created shock and awe at this time because, they were in fact talking about contracting wages, taking away safety nets from the labor force. And there was quite an outcry and a pushback, and then all the governments that were suggesting it dropped it. So I was interested to know that what are the reforms you're talking about? Again, on a priority of 1, 2, 3, what is it you do?
Well, we've been talking reforms for so long that it's pretty clear what we need to do. And the unfortunate aspect is we don't do it in a way that is sensible and that takes all sides into account. Labor reform doesn't mean overnight you take away all labor protections. Labor reform means you do the things that have been talked about for so long. On the one hand, you make employment a little more secure for that contract worker who has no security of employment, is fired at the end of every year. We have a lot of those. On the other hand, what you say is, look, I'll make it a little more secure, but you will not become permanent. You will not become unfireable. But say, look, for you guys who are contractual workers, we're going to change the parameters. You will stay on, but the longer you stay in the firm, the more rights you acquire, the more protections you acquire. But you can be let go. If after 5 or 6 years we find there's not enough work, there may be a norm by which the most recently hired gets let go first, but you're not protected for life. There's a way of bringing in flexibility, which actually is beneficial for both sides because the firm doesn't need to have temporary workers who cannot be trained because they have to be fired every year. And the worker gets more training, gets more capabilities so that even if they let go, they first get some severance pay based on the number of years they've been there. But then they go out there in the market and they have skills because they come from a large firm where they've been trained well. So there's a dialogue to be had on how can we improve training, how can we improve severance pay, but how can we improve labor flexibility also. Overnight, just saying, we can fire anybody we want for the next 3 years. Yeah. Why would anybody hire when they know that after that you have to, keep them permanently?
Sure. No, the permanence is one aspect, but like you said, the shock was that they were wanting to reduce the minimum wages, take away all social security, all sort of.
I think this reflects really half-baked thinking. And given how much we have thought about this issue and debated it, reforms means, there are thousands of committees which have looked at every aspect: land reform, labor reform, business environment reform. Take business environment. We've done such wonders on business environment. But then there's a very sad email which I was sent by an entrepreneur, and it seems like it's genuine, who was trying to open a factory. And, the enormous number of permissions he had to get in order to open the factory. And this gentleman didn't want to pay any gratification. And, he just complained that he was stuck. Now, fortunately, at the end, some person in a high position read it and used the appropriate influence to get him his licenses. But despite all our talk about doing business, it is still very hard to open a business in India. Those are the kinds of reforms we need to generate the animal spirits. The reality is we have limited resources to provide the relief we talked about. We have, therefore, much less to provide any stimulus to get the economy back, to where it was and further. So on the one hand, we need to generate more resources. This implies another set of reforms we've talked about, privatize some of our public sector entities. I think that, again, we've made statements we will do it, but the markets are pretty buoyant now. Why aren't we selling some of these assets? What are we waiting for? I mean, for it to go back to where it was, maybe it doesn't go back. Let's generate resources when we can. That's on generating resources, but also on generating animal spirits for business. How do we energize business to invest more? And not just the big influential houses, but the small, medium-sized entrepreneur. One is, of course, help that entrepreneur deal with stress. The other is to help them get credit to start again when they need to. But third is to create the environment where they don't feel that they're being terrorized by the license permit Raj.
Well, you spoke about, again, this business environment, and that's the, that it all kind of gets mutilated in the process. Because right now, the other big thing that's been pushed through are kind of sweeping changes to the environment protection laws and requirements, And there's actually been outcry, because the one thing one would imagine we've all become conscious of is that economy is a subset of the environment. But, again, the reform is that you just set it all aside and run through the environment, So those are worrying things, that when you do it in distress, you just set it aside.
Just on that issue, we need to learn how to put in place regulations that are absolutely necessary. Environment is one of them, but enforce whatever we have. What we tend to do is put a huge number of regulations, many of which are unnecessary, unviable, hard to enforce, and thereby give the relevant bureaucrat an enormous amount of power to deny, to delay, to harass. Sometimes it's not for gratification. Sometimes it's just because they think they're doing their job, when in fact the regulation does very little. So you have to ask yourself, is the regulation working as advertised? And including for our environment, environment is not an excuse for infinite delay. And that's why we go, the other extreme and say no environment permissions required. We need very streamlined environment process, which comes out and says, okay, you can do it or you can't, and gives you the answer within so many days, not an indefinite process. And we also have to recognize that our bureaucracy has limitations.
So, I'm going to come to the whole issue of employment, because that was already looming even before the pandemic. But I just wanted to ask you about a metaphor, which is that our house is on fire, and it's pretty clear the house is on fire. So at this juncture, do we need like a short-term dousing of the fire? Or do we need to kind of go into the blueprint of the house and restructure the house? So, I'm coming back to my original question, that if you were sitting in the absolute center seat right now and designing this whole complex thing, will you sort of maybe spell out 2-3 steps that you would do immediately and then in the long term?
It's good to give an example of what we're facing. We're like a patient who had some severe maladies to begin with, who's been in an accident. Okay, so the first thing that you do in the accident is to essentially stabilize the patient, because without that, there's nothing to work on. So I think we have to focus on that stabilization. And that's where all the stuff we talked about in terms of relief measures comes in. You have to provide, say, funds to households to be able to keep body and soul together. And the longer the slowdown sort of progresses, the more that might be necessary. We don't have formal unemployment insurance. Some kinds of transfers to the poorest households may be warranted over this period. The next step, once you stabilize the patient, is to see how do we get strong recovery. And that's when you need to also think about the other maladies that afflict the patient. But when you focus on which maladies to tackle, you have to understand the patient is weak. Don't tackle maladies which, in fact will set back the patient a little bit. And some reforms will potentially sort of make things a little worse initially before they make things better. So think about the reforms that don't necessarily cost people that much, but in fact create more opportunities, right? So I would think, for example, we just talked about the business environment. I would think about tariffs, not raising tariffs. I would think about the whole tariff structure and think about where we can get more employment by putting things together. And that may require some imports. So how do I sort of incentivize the ability to get those imports in while energizing the export process? So think about some of those things in a more clever fashion than we've done. We have this sort of reform by stealth because we think once we announce the reform, the vested interests will rise up and make sure they don't happen. And sometimes that is useful. But sometimes it's useful to say, here's where I want to go. And that energizes investors to come in, which facilitates your ability to do more. So announce a set of reforms you can do now. And that may include business environment, that may include the export environment, that may include the credit environment. Those are things you can do in the short run. But also announce what you will do over the medium term, which could include labor reforms, for example. Something which needs a lot of work on is land reforms. How do you make it easier for, on the one hand, businesses, infrastructure to acquire the land they need to build, while protecting the rights of the farmer so that they're not expropriated at a very low price? Can we improve the ability to sell land and buy land? Where are the places where we need to reform more? Can we make it easier for farmers to lease land so that good farmers can lease from others who have very, very tiny holdings? The tiny holder doesn't have to sell. They can still get the lease from the land, but then they can go work in the city. So these are things we need to think about. I mean, you asked me, prioritize this, that. I would say, take every reform you can do the ones that are low cost immediately. And that will create a better environment because you're doing a lot together. The ones that are costly, the ones that are going to affect people, the ones that will require negotiation, lay them out. I will do this by this time. I mean, we have a government with a 5-year term. Why doesn't it give us more of a sense of the roadmap on economics? It does a lot of roadmaps elsewhere on social politics, etc. Why doesn't it focus on the economics? Because really the country needs an economic plan. Doesn't have.
So, Dr. Rajan, you've opened up many lines of inquiry. The impact and wisdom of privatization, which one can debate, the impact of land reforms on communities, who are the new real employment generators, and as the RBI said, the fact that big corporate tax cut did not go into new investment cycles. But before we come to any of that, the question I'd like to ask you is that regardless of whether you're opposed to their politics or not, even the worst detractors of this government would accept that they are exceptionally politically astute. So across the board, when economists are suggesting that they spend, and someone like you has said that at this moment it doesn't matter if there's a fiscal deficit because that's true for countries across the world. So then why are they not doing what economists across the board are suggesting they do?
I don't know. I have no idea. It's a question I ask every person I meet. We've been talking. I mean, I've been talking about the damage that's been done for 4 months now, because you can see it in the West. And if the West is spending 20% of GDP to try and repair, given that we've had a much more prolonged shutdown, and still we have a rampaging coronavirus problem, the damage that is done to our households, our firms, has to be significantly greater, especially because they have low buffers. Now, it may be that the Indian way of jugaad will find a way out of all this. Our firms are very experienced and they will do something or the other. But almost surely there will be a whole load of debt, of non-payment, which will have to be dealt with. And the experience from other countries is when that is there, it slows down growth even more. So, we should be putting in place structures to deal with all this. We should have been spending, and we also should have a whole set of reforms in mind. Now, what I understand is it's all being worked on, but I'd love to see something emerge, because the longer that is delayed, the more the damage that will have to be repaired.
It's very interesting because there's a kind of gap between, even whatever little bit of information one is getting back, which is, even the RBI, they said that it's the poor that's been the most severely hit. And yet when you speak to political people within the BJP, within government, and again, the thing is that they do have feet on ground. They have possibly more years on ground than any other political party at this point. And they keep saying that, people are okay, people are happy. And there's also not that kind of unrest. There isn't, large-scale rioting or even just people coming out on the streets expressing distress. So there's a bit of discrepancy in what one is thinking the picture is and the emotional, feedback coming from the ground. What do you think accounts for that?
I don't know. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's no problem. All our firms are ready to run. That's
no, right now, I'm not even talking the firms. I'm talking just, we saw this most compacted mass exodus of people, possibly even more than in partition, over those 50 days. And now one is hearing that even rural India is saturated and they're coming back because there isn't that much work or relief there. But one isn't seeing unrest. And politically, when you talk to people, they say, oh, enough food is reaching people. We're giving a bit of money. It's okay. Up to November, it's all right. So are we missing something here?
I mean, the protest doesn't sort of happen without any organization. And it may be that, there is a certain amount of dissatisfaction, but that's not coming out because there isn't, organization. And organization may be stymied by the nature of the coronavirus, that you can't sort of organize people on Zoom to protest. So there may be reasons why, even if people are dissatisfied, they're not coming out on the streets. That said, I think it's extremely important, which is what I said earlier, that the government know that in fact they're not being hurt, that the lack of protest is because they're satisfied rather than they don't have the avenues to protest. There's a big difference. And it's a difference not just for your political future, it's a difference because of the economic and moral reality. You do have a duty to your people. And if your people are suffering, you have to do something about it. And simply going into a shell and saying, well, we don't hear the protest, or they have enough savings in their Jandan accounts, is no answer.
Well, that brings us, we'll come to employment and I'll circle back to the economy. But right now, because of what we're speaking, the whole issue of democracy comes up. And, you've often said that a robust economy also requires a robust democracy. And your description of a democracy wasn't just that you get to vote every 5 years, but that you have an investigative press, you have lively public debate, sometimes even unpolitical, what's not politically correct, and NGOs and civil society and, a polyphonous politics. So today, on a scale of 10, where would you rate the health of our democracy?
I think there are organizations that rate the quality of democracy. And of course, when those organizations rate us well, we are very happy. And when they rate us poorly, we sort of cast aspersions on their rating methods. I think the reality is that certainly in the newspapers I read here in the West, of course I read the Indian newspapers also, but in the West, the sense is India has moved away from democracy. Of course, we have elections, and of course, you still can speak. You and I are speaking, and I'm hopeful that this will continue. But there are other ways that the institutions become more eroded. Does the press have as much willingness to speak out, to track down potential areas of malfeasance, to raise questions about various issues, including big constitutional changes? And do our institutions, the Supreme Court, for example, Have they taken appropriate action at appropriate times? We've had very sort of thoughtful critics raise questions about the nature of functioning of our institutions. We just had the picture of an election commissioner who had taken measures against the government, or at least had not kowtowed to the normal line. There was a certain amount of pressure on his family. And then because for a variety of reasons that it's hard to speculate on, he was offered a job in the ADB. Is a job in the ADB more important than the chief election commissioner? Those are questions that we have to keep raising to ask whether even post-elections, the democracy is as vibrant as it ought to be.
Yeah, in fact, we were just talking about protest and channels of protest. I would definitely say that one of the very dismaying aspects of our political life right now is that to protest is itself seen as anti-national, is seen as disruptive. And if you're organizing protests, then it's seen as if you're organizing discontent rather than mediating it or channeling it. So that's a big shift,
Absolutely. I've obtained some solace by reading about our freedom struggle and the sort of debates that went on while we framed our constitution. And you realize that India was a beacon to the rest of the world at that time. Gandhi's way of protest is what gave people like John Lewis, who just died, let me make some trouble, some good trouble. Because standing silent in the face of these kinds of actions is complicity. I think we need to embrace that, because otherwise the institutions that our founding fathers gave us will erode, and erode very fast. We saw it erode one time before during the emergency. And in fact, I think it was Advani who remonstrated with the press, saying when they asked you to bow, you knelt, or words to that effect. And unfortunately, it is that party, the party of his, which is now in government, where again you see some concerns about institutions. And I think even well-meaning people in that party should stand up and say, we need to protect these. It is not a crime to question the government. It is not a crime to have protests. In fact, the young should be protesting. If they don't protest when they're young, when will they protest?
And how will the world renew itself if the young don't protest?
Exactly. And, I'm an old fogey that it's important. I mean, I remember when we were young in college, Arun Shourie came to give a speech, and he was saying, why are you guys here? You should be out there sort of on the streets complaining. Now, I'm not saying that every student should be out there, but it is important for students to ask questions of the system. It's important for the young to ask questions. In fact, it's important for everyone, young, old, middle-aged, to keep asking questions of the system. This is what Prashant Bhushan has submitted to the Supreme Court, and I think he's absolutely right. When we have institutions that brook no questions, we are in deep trouble.
So, you make a strong case for that. I'm just going to come back to the economy because we left two things unaddressed. One is this huge crisis. It's almost like a volcano brewing about unemployment. And that was brewing even before the pandemic hit. We were looking at a 40-year high of unemployment. But in all fairness, that's also something that's been brewing through previous governments as well. I remember Mr. Chidambaram once shared with me a very startling figure, which was that, from 1991, he said almost only about 30 million formal jobs had been created, which is a tiny figure. And that all the traditional ideas where employment is generated are no longer yielding employment. So when you're sort of urging that there should be employment, government should spend, again, where do you think the new employment generators can be? Is there a radical shift this economy needs?
I think if you look at what has happened to economic reforms, the last major economic reforms were done by first incarnation of the NDA, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Those reforms gave us some momentum and took us to fairly strong growth, which tapered off with the global financial crisis, and then we slowed down. Now, since then, we've had, sporadic reform, but nothing like, the reforms in 1991, which continued through the 1990s and culminated with the reforms during the Vajpayee government. But since then, we haven't had that, that sustained focus on what do we need to create an environment in which we can grow relatively fast. And because of this sort of semi-paralysis in reforms, we haven't been able to create jobs. So our population dividend is in great danger of turning into a problem. Now, what this means is we need to take actions on every side and make sure it works. We've got underemployment in some ways. Many people who spend many years in education get jobs below what their degrees are. At the same time, we don't have the kind of output that China has, who are manning its AI, its IT, its this and that, or at least, we're not using our highly skilled manpower as well. What is our presence in artificial intelligence? Nobody talks about India as a power in artificial intelligence. They talk about North Korea because of its hackers. They talk about, of course, China, the United States. But where are we on artificial intelligence? I hear people from the Planning Commission every once in a while dropping the words AI, machine learning, blockchain, and saying it very fast. But what exactly are we doing there? Similarly, fintech. There's no reason why India cannot succeed. I mean, India was poised to succeed. If you ask the question in 2007, 2008, everybody would say India's just on China's footsteps, maybe 5 to 10 years behind. I don't think we can say that today. Unfortunately, we've lost decades. I would say, a decade and a half. Despite governments of different kinds. I'm not blaming it on one government.
No, in fact, I was just going to ask you that question, that you named the period as 2007, 2008. Of course, the recession hit, but at that time, India seemed to do quite well, while the rest of the world was feeling the recession. But do you think the UPA 2 made a lot of mistakes as well? Mr. Modi's government points back to all the errors of the UPA 2. They say they inherited a mess. And they also say they inherited the NPA mess, high inflation, high NPAs, and that the whole NPA, cascade really began with the UPA 2. Would you agree with that?
Every government inherits problems from the previous government. At some point, you have to stop complaining and say, it's my problem now. After 6 years, isn't it time the Modi government stopped complaining about the past and said, this is my problem? That said, I think the problem is not just one of legacy problems. It's that UPA 2 wasn't allowed to function, couldn't pass anything. It talked about GST, all the stuff the government has done now, the bankruptcy code, a new tax regime, was talked about in UPA 2. But it couldn't do anything because Parliament didn't function. Remember the days when Parliament was shut, nothing happened? We wasted 5 years because nothing could get done, right? We need a national consensus that, protest all you want, but don't hold up economic growth because that is really important for the people. I think there's plenty of blame to spread. But even if you, take all that and say, okay, we've had 6 years since then. What really have we done in terms of economic reforms? There's, stuff at the margin. I think the Modi government has done very well on distribution. It has taken the schemes the Congress had and improved on them. So there is a better distribution, which is partly why we are in such a fiscal mess, because we haven't generated the income, but we found better ways to distribute it. we need to figure out how to generate the income also. It's ironic because, if you looked at what, the NDA was saying as it came into power in 2014, it was, we've gone too much on the distribution side. This Narega, this, that, these are all bad things. What we want to do is make people self-reliant, give them good jobs. It's all about good jobs, good jobs, good jobs. And where they haven't succeeded is on the jobs, even before the pandemic. A lot will be blamed on the pandemic. Pandemic messed us up. No, things were really bad before the pandemic. In fact, because they were so bad, we have had such little ability to deal with it economically. But the real issue is, we didn't create those jobs, but we started the redistribution in a more effective way, the so-called jam trinity, etc.
Dr. Rajan, on this, I would push back even on a little bit on what you're saying, because whenever there's this talk about distribution, it's seen as bleeding heart, left of center, not sustainable, and we start talking about Narega and food security and how it's unsustainable. But food security was like 70,000 crore, and it's actually the one act that saved India right now, or any of these distributive mechanisms. And on the other hand, when we worry about this, we've also seen the biggest concentration of wealth in human history, possibly, barring. So, and it's interesting that Christine Lagarde at the IMF, at World Economic Forum, finally inequity has become the hot topic, even in World Economic Forum, and one has seen the fallout of that on politics in Europe, now in America.
Right.
In India, this pandemic has possibly again shown the sheer stark inequity that exists. So,
look, I am not against redistribution. I'm saying they did it well, so I'm complimenting them. There is a gap, which is targeting. We still cannot target the very poor, because that would have been ideal under these circumstances. We talk about the jam trinity, Jandan, with the mobile and Aadhaar, but why is it that we can't send more cash to the poorest households? Because we don't know who they are. We can't target them particularly well. So we have these different schemes. Yes, widows' pensions, this, that, we do it, but we still can't target the very poor. If we could do that, we would have achieved what we need to, at least to deal with these kinds of sudden problems. So I'm all with you on the issue of redistribution. But I would also say that part of the concentration of wealth in this country is simply because we haven't had sensible reforms. Instead of having one Infosys, one Wipro, we should have 10, 15 of them. The fact that wealth is concentrating so much that only a few players are able to bid for our airports, bid for our ports, that our competition commission seems to be in a little bit of a stasis at this point. It must reflect the fact that opportunities are very, very narrow, limited, and still require the helping hand of the government. If that is the case, we haven't moved away from the accusations of crony capitalism that have always dogged our country, whether it was through the license permit Raj period, or have we created a new license permit Raj period where it's all hidden license permits.
I'm just going to stay with this issue a little bit. I did an interview with Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw a couple of weeks ago, and she actually very candidly said that why is government bailing out big companies? Big companies should have resilience. And she said, we are back to that it's too big to fail. And so, the government steps in. And she was saying it's actually the small guys who really should be getting that help. And she was critiquing her own fraternity. So again, I would ask you that, especially in the face of this pandemic and what it's shown, have you had any major rethink yourself? Is there any intellectual, sort of perspective shift that you have personally had on the Indian economy?
Look, I just think that we've delayed reforms too long. And when you talk, for example, of the large companies, it is still troubling that even today, it's not they're not really talking about the freedom to expand, about dealing with a lot of this permission business, etc. Certainly in the time that I was in the Ministry of Finance or at the RBI, it was always special interests. Why don't you give me a reduction in taxes or give me a boost in this or that? Never about why don't you create an environment where we can grow much more. And every company looks for the budget for what special dispensations are there for me, what tariffs will be raised to protect me further. In the pandemic, large firms have the ability to tap markets. The ones that cannot because they're too levered, the issue should not be about government help. The issue should be how do we restructure their debt quickly? And that's why I think a lot of focus now in the government should be on how do we create this restructuring process so that debts can be written down in an effective way and these companies can flourish again, but they don't need more government help. A lot of people say the pandemic is not my fault. Well, it's not the taxpayer's fault either. Yeah. So why should the taxpayer pay the price, or why should the poorest pay the price because there's no money in the tax bill to fund them? So what we need is an equitable adjustment. We need to make sure our productive assets are back on track. And that does mean overly levered firms may need some relief, otherwise they will not function. But that relief has to be accompanied by some loss sharing by the promoter.
You mentioned the pressure you were under when you were in the RBI from particular categories who wanted rebates or cuts. What other pressures were you under while you were at the RBI?
Well, I think we'll leave that. It's not. It's a place which is, on the one hand, very lonely because you really can't fraternize with the people you regulate, and the RBI is a very strong organization, but it's a hierarchical one. Everybody wants their little bit, and because you are an organization with tremendous powers, you have to be very careful that you don't succumb to those pressures. And sometimes there are entities that have significant power, but that's part of the job. I think Dr. Manmohan Singh has said that was one of his most enjoyable jobs, but it's also a very lonely job. I may be misquoting him, so take this with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, but the adjective you'd put would be lonely?
Many senior positions are lonely but this in particular, because you hold so many secrets and you can't, monetary policy has to be a secret till it's announced. The kinds of sometimes regulations that you implement have to be secrets till they're announced. So there are things you have to keep to yourself.
So, I wanted to do a slightly bigger picture, telescope out a bit. In your book, when you were examining this whole triad of market and state and capital, you brought up the whole issue of communities, and that it's always been left out, or as I said, it's always typecast as a concern of the lefties, So it was very intriguing when you said that really for markets and capital to work and state to work well, it needs to take in communities as stakeholders. Do you see that happening in India sufficiently? And I would say that even when the UP was in power, it was actually reviled. Even right now, you mentioned Narega or civil society groups or wherever the stakeholder has to be the community, it ends up being reviled. Do you think that that's a real design change that needs to happen in India?
I think it is. Again, I was telling you about looking at the constitutional debates. This was a big issue because, of course, Gandhi was very much for locating the center of government in the village or in the municipality and not in the federal government. But there were many others who believed that this was problematic for India because the watchword at that moment was unity. How do we create a unified central government manned by Indians, given that we just suffered a huge partition? How do we unite the princely states within our country? And so centralization, the Constitution offers a fair amount of decentralization between the states and the union and the federal government, central government, I should say. But it is perhaps less than some people wanted. And they felt that governance, even by the state capital, would be too distant from the villages, which is where governance has been located historically. And of course, this has been a debate which has come back once we felt the country had enough unity. One of the advantages of decentralization is you have multiple layers of power, and they mean that power doesn't get overly concentrated. To some extent, the reason I believe this government has not been able to function that well is because power is really concentrated in the Prime Minister's office. And therefore, the other arms, even the ministries, don't work as effectively as they could if they had more of a sense of empowerment. But the states could be very important aspects in our progress, and the districts, the panchayats, the committee. I mean, look at the terrible state of some of our cities. In part, it is because there's no governance power in the city. The mayor is sometimes just a title. They have limited powers. So getting more powers to the cities of being able to raise funds, keeping some of the funds that come from the taxes in the city, could improve the quality of our city infrastructure tremendously. Similarly, in the villages, a greater sense of empowerment coupled with funding. Can they monitor the village school? Can they make sure that it is adequately supported with the help of the parents? Getting a sense of ownership does wonders for your democracy, but also creates checks and balances. In fact, centralization may be the wrong thing. We need to decentralize more with the center applying checks and balances at arm's length. It knows what's going on. It knows the funding it's sent. It can evaluate how it's been spent, but it does it lightly. It doesn't say, thou will do this and thou shalt do that. That's something that would be a better system in my view.
Just do some predictive stuff. That there's a lot of people who feel that what we're really looking at is a pain of 2 years, and then things will start rising, that this is more circumstantial. Do you think that actually the pain is yet to come, or do you think this time frame of 2 years and then we'll be okay is reasonable and justifiable?
The reality is nobody knows. I mean, everybody's already banking on a vaccine next year. Maybe, but there's still some gap. And of course, we're hoping that the virus doesn't mutate in the meantime and create more horrific outcomes. What do we do, in repair, relief, and recovery? And those are, that should give everybody plenty to think about.
Thank you. I asked you one question at the beginning, which was that Mr. Manmohan Singh said we should spend almost up to 10 lakh crore. This government, as most analysts have said, have spent about 1 lakh crore on relief. I just wanted to end with asking that first question, that if you were in the seat right now, knowing the whole lay of the land, what is it that you would have spent in immediate relief?
I think putting out a number out there is not what you want to do. What you want to do is first create the space to spend. By putting in medium-term measures, we're going to sell assets, we're going to put in a fiscal council, we're going to bring our debt down over time. So rest assured, the spending is not going to create a fiscal mess down the line. And on the other hand, I would say, okay, what are the emergency places I need to spend? Let me make sure I spend on that. Then what is the stuff I need to do to get the economy back? So prioritize the spending. Here are things immediately, here are the things, et cetera, until you get to the place, this spending would be nice to have. Well, maybe do that later. So there are priorities. Sequence and start spending on the priorities. And keep checking that it's doing what you hope to do. If it's not, change the way you spend. You talked about relief to MSMEs. Let's have a bunch of things in process, but if it's not working as advertised, make the changes that are needed. So policy, monitor, change. Policy, monitor, change. That's what we need to do.
Thank you so much. One looks forward to your interviews and your pronouncements because one looks to you to make good trouble. So I hope you do that.
Well, don't say pronouncements. It sounds like I have a view from on top. No, my questions and my conjectures. That's a better way of saying it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Raghu, for being here.